Hope we're all well. Good, on this nice, cold, rainy night. And welcome back, Brother Bruce. Welcome back, the Scots. Good to see you back from Japan. Bathsheba, one of the women of the Bible. Background. Let's get ourselves some context to this tonight. So, as a background, we see that David, King David, had great campaigns through his time against the Philistines and against the Ammonites, and great victories with the help of Yahweh. And he's now secure as king in Jerusalem. The ark is safely in the hands of the Israelites, and it's safely amongst the army, fighting away at those battles, as we find out, making sure that there is no one that can rise up against and defy the armies of the living God. And chapter 10 shows us how David all but completely destroys the uprising of a confederacy between the Ammonites and the Syrian mercenaries. And we find that his army now lays siege to the last of the Ammonite uprising at a stronghold called Rabbah. And then we come to this chapter that we had read tonight, which, had it not been recorded, we would have a reduced understanding, I believe, of the fact that all men and women are human. And not only that, but it gives us greater depth of meaning to some of Scripture, some of the verses that we know quite well, such as in Jeremiah, where it says that it is not within man to direct his own steps. Or, as it says in 1 Corinthians 10, let he who thinks he stands beware or take heed lest he fall. If it were not for this chapter, those verses wouldn't mean quite so much, I believe. Without this chapter, we may not also, or we may have a reduced understanding, if you like, of the immense and unbelievable and wonderful character of our Heavenly Father and his willingness to show favour, undeserved favour, to those who have fallen and yet recognise their error, and those that look up, just like the children of Israel did to that brazen serpent, looking up in belief that God could save them. Without this chapter, and some of the following chapters, chapter 12, and some of the subsequent thoughts that come out in Psalms, we would have a reduced understanding of the traps and the deceptive mechanism that sin can be to produce such profound lows in the lives of even the most reverent of people. And so we come to this gruelling episode, which begins with an introduction of a woman, one of the women of the Bible. Not the nicest way to introduce someone either, because she's introduced to us as she's having a bath out in the open. And whilst there are many different views about her, I've read many things around my studies on this, and really there's not a whole lot written about her in this record. We find that she is listed among those who form the ancestry of the king that will rule the world. And a final note before we get into this, before I really do get started, I feel the need to highlight that from my studies and from reading some of the other studies and people that have gleaned from this event, that it is clearly taken from the perspective of David's sin, and primarily the consequences that David had as a result of his actions. And as a result, the record provides little about the actions and the thoughts of Bathsheba herself. So at times I will try to use some political licence in trying to build some of the emotion, and I will try not to go too far by sticking to the script as much as I can. And I'll do this through means of some of the clues that I see throughout the record. So let's just have a look at it then. We start in chapter 11, and we get the context here that it's the time when kings go out to battle, which is usually in the springtime. After the big long winter, we're now getting to a period where kings can now go out to battle. But peculiarly, we find that David, in verse 1, he stays behind, which is a bit unusual. And we ask ourselves, well, why would he do that? He's approaching 50 years of age now. Perhaps he's feeling a little more secure in the fact that he's pretty much gotten rid of all the opposition. Perhaps he's feeling that, well, the men that are around him, they've proven themselves over and over that I'm in good hands. Do I really need to be going out there and leading this battle? But it's interesting, isn't it? Because perhaps this is the very first error that David makes here in this record. He decides to stay home. Not only does he decide to stay home, but here in this next few verses we find that he's alone. Perhaps he's even bored. But certainly he is idle, whereas he should be out fighting battles. So not keeping himself so busy, he decides then to go for a walk one night, in verse 2, and look what happens. Little does he know that his life is about to take a turn for the worst. You know, in verse 2 we have here the most common description of just how slippery the process of temptation can be. I'll put that up on the screen for you, because here in verse 2 it says that he saw a woman and she was very beautiful. And when something's very beautiful, you tend to linger, don't you? And continue to watch. And it says that he looked upon her because she was very beautiful. So he looked upon her. He liked what he saw. In verse 3, the next step, which is to inquire. Isn't that the same as Genesis 3, verse 16? The woman saw. The woman saw that it was pleasant to the eyes, and she desired. It was a fruit that was to be desired. Isn't that the same? Well, here David follows that same pattern that human nature is prone to, that pattern of temptation, of bringing him into a problem. Because then we find in verse 4 that not only does he inquire, but just as the woman took of that fruit, it says that he took. And he took her. Now, I've got there James 1. Perhaps we can turn over to James 1, just have a brief look at this. These are words that you're probably very familiar with. But James 1 has a very interesting way of putting this, of course, and very interesting in the light of this actual episode. Almost as if it's written thinking about this very episode. James 1 writes, and David, of course, allows temptation to conceive, you see. And in James 1, we have this connection that every man is tempted, in verse 14, when he is drawn away of his own, and that has the idea of privately, or when alone, or separately. When he is drawn away of his own lust, and the word lust there is to desire for what is forbidden. When he is drawn away in his own lust and enticed. And the word there for enticed has this meaning of trapped, deluded and deceived. And isn't that what we do when we determine to sin? Aren't we really only deceiving ourselves? In verse 15, James goes on to say that when lust, or the desire for the forbidden, has conceived, which means to fall pregnant, it brings forth or gives birth to sin. Verse 15. And then when sin is finished, or it's come to its end, it brings forth death. And isn't that the precise summary of the struggle against sin for all of us? See, God hasn't tempted us, has he? We're more than capable of doing that for ourselves. Usually, it's done in private. And usually by dwelling on something forbidden. But he hath not dealt with us after our sins, nor hath he rewarded us after our iniquities, Psalm 103 says. And isn't that a wonderful thing? And so going back to the chapter in Samuel, chapter 11. We read on in verse 3 through to 5. And so we see David acts here. He acts upon his temptation, the thoughts that are in his mind, and he's turning that temptation into sin. And so David inquires about her. But in verse 3, we have one of his. It just says, one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Surely this was enough to stop the pending foolishness in David's heart. And we don't know what it was that we don't know what that was said to David. No doubt one of the court advisors was one of the people that came and saw him. There was a lot of people in the court around David, and David had a lot of advisors, and we don't know who that was that said that to him. But whether or not they said that to prick his conscience or not, we don't know. But surely, as David was a man after God's own heart, that should have been enough to stop this foolishness. She is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. But David doesn't take those words as a warning at all, and he goes on to take her. Now, I've read many opinions regarding Bathsheba in this event. Lots of things that have been written about this whole event. And was she innocent, for example? Was she calculated and determined, maybe? Some have even suggested this. Was she easily influenced, perhaps? Unintentionally caught up in the same situation as David? Some suggest that Bathsheba knew exactly what she was doing, that she was setting a trap for David because she wanted to be the queen. She was determined, but you know what? There is no proof of that at all. No proof of that. Some suggest that Bathsheba was totally innocent of this, seeing that she was summoned by the king. And if you're summoned by the king, you really don't have a choice in the matter. Kings had absolute power, especially in those days. But of course, there's no real proof of that either. David did have absolute power as king, there's no doubt. But David was no ordinary king either. He was a king who loved Yahweh, who was open to listening, even to a woman. Abigail is proof of that. I don't believe that Bathsheba was forced either by David, as the record doesn't suggest that or doesn't say that. It certainly is very explicit around that when we look at chapter 13, which we won't do tonight, when we talk about the incident between Amnon and Tamar. It's explicit and goes into great lengths about that, but it doesn't do that here. Certainly it does suggest that David was the instigator, without a doubt. But Bathsheba appears to, in my opinion, go along with this, perhaps being easily led or influenced, without any mention at all of her objecting. And it may not be wise to speculate too much, but in my opinion, the record seems to suggest the actual fact was between a man, or the act, should I say, it was between a man and a woman, which neither tried to stop. And I truly believe that everyone has a choice. We all need to choose. Just like Abigail made a choice. Just like Daniel and his friends made a choice, even though it meant punishment that would mean their death. Everyone has a choice. But does this mean that I'm reducing the severity or the wrong that David did by suggesting this? That Bathsheba made it easier for him? Well, by no means. Am I suggesting that Bathsheba is a bad person for not standing up? By no means. Am I suggesting that both are tangled up in this as mere human beings, with a propensity in their nature to fall to temptation? Absolutely I am. And so in verse 5, we read, "And the woman conceived and sent and told David and said, I am with child. And the very fact that phrase is in there, I am with child, tends to make me believe that there was a mutual guilt. There's certainly guilt on both parties to suggest I am with child. It's interesting in the margin in mine anyway that references Leviticus 20, which we'll come to. But it raises more questions about how this communication must have been made. Can you just picture the scene? Just imagine this for a moment. Bathsheba, she's now back in her house. She's now conceived. She has a child. How does she get that message to the king? How did she do that? Should she say anything? Should she stay quiet? Should she mention it at all? Who can she trust in the court? Who does she know? The implications of suggesting this was huge for both her and the king. And although we're not given the answers to these and many more questions, you can't help but picture the intensity of this situation, not just for David, but also for Bathsheba. And brings to mind a quote from a much lesser author, doesn't it? Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we set out to deceive. And the coming actions we'll read about and the decisions that will be made only make that tangled web an absolute mess. And so we have this cover-up plan that occurs now from David. And that's running through from verse 6 through to 17. David tries to cover this up. Isn't that the way that humans deal with sin in the first place? Isn't that what happened back in the garden? Immediately, the shame of it. This feeling of, I need to cover this up now. I need to fix this. And so he does this very thing. And so we come to this man Uriah, because in verse 6, David sends for Uriah the Hittite. What do we know about Uriah the Hittite? Oh, I'll just skip over this quickly. We do have, I'll put up this slide around the names, which is quite interesting in itself. Bathsheba means daughter of an oath, which is interesting. The names don't always link up well with their lives, but in these cases it's not too bad. Whereas Bathsheba meaning a daughter of an oath was broken, of course, between her husband. And her husband knew her as a daughter, as we find out later. And then, of course, Uriah means Yahweh is my light. What a fitting name for him. A man that is not recorded that he did anything wrong, and yet he was a Hittite. And he came to Yahweh. He came to the light. But who was this Uriah? Well, we're told that he's a Hittite, so he's obviously a convert, and he's also David's mighty man, one of his mighty men. And the word there I put up there on the screen is the word Gibor for the word mighty. It's got some interesting links, actually. It has a few meanings, basically warrior or champion. And if you have a look at, we won't do this tonight, but Isaiah 9 verse 6, make a note of it. It's actually used to describe the name of Christ, except it doesn't put men beside it, it says mighty God. It's that same word, Gibor. It's actually the name, mighty God, is actually the name of the angel Gabriel there. But I put the question there, I posed this question, I was thinking about this. Why were these men called mighty men? If you come over to 2 Samuel 23, we have one of the lists of these mighty men in chapter 23. And you will see right at the end of that big long list of names, the very last verse, we have Uriah the Hittite. It says 37 in all. Why were they mighty men though? We know that they did great acts. There's a lot of things recorded about how that they slew these great giants, and they slew lions, and they slew hundreds of men. They did great mighty acts, that is for sure. But when thinking about this, it's really because they were David's mighty men. And the reason I say that is because of their association and their loyalty that they had to David. Do you know they were prepared to die for David? They were prepared to do acts that no one else would do just for David. When David wanted to drink the water of that well, his men just went and got it for him. Threw the enemy, grabbed the water, came back. They were prepared to die for David. But it's interesting that Jesus Christ picks this up in Matthew 12, verse 3, and he talks about David and his mighty men. And he uses this one phrase, that they that were with him. Isn't it amazing? So there we have in Isaiah 9, verse 6, this mighty God, Jesus, Gibor, El. How were they mighty men? Because they were associated with David. How are we mighty men and women? How can we be this mighty men and women? Well, it's by our loyalty and our association to Christ. John 6 verse 37 says, "Him that comes to me I will in no wise cast out." Romans 8 tells us that we are more than conquerors, more than these great mighty warriors, through him that loved us. So just as these men did great mighty acts, they were his mighty men because they were so loyal and associated to David, their king, just as we must be to our Lord and our King. By the way, there's more than one Uriah recorded in the Bible. Does anyone know who? There's one other. Does anyone know who that is? No? No, there's a Uriah the priest, isn't there? Uriah the priest who helped to re-establish the building of Jerusalem after the period of captivity. But this is Uriah the Hittite, and he is numbered among the 37. And I've actually got something else for you. You can come to me afterwards if you like. In this list in chapter 23 of 2 Samuel, it says that right at the end that Uriah was at the end, and there was 37 in all. And we keep talking about the 30 mighty men, I know, but I can count in this chapter 36 mighty men. 2 lots of 3s, they were the closest ones, they were the, if you want to call, mightiest ones. And then 30. Now, I know I didn't go to school very much, but I'm thinking that's 36, so if you can come up with a 37th one, I would love to hear about it afterwards. So interesting, isn't it? So we know something else about Uriah. Uriah was older than his wife, Bathsheba. How do we know this? Well, there's a couple of clues. And the first clue is in this same chapter, chapter 23. So if we go to verse 34, and it's listing out these mighty men, verse 34 comes across Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, the Golanite. So if we move back over to chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, we've already just read that, haven't we, in verse 3. This is the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah. So Uriah was contemporary as a soldier with Eliam. So it's quite likely that they were of a similar age as well, as is similar in their ability to fight. So it's very likely that Bathsheba was much younger than Uriah. The other clue is, of course, in chapter 12, where we pick up a bit later on, that she is seen by Uriah as like a daughter. Okay, so let's talk about what happens then in this story. Coming back to verse 6. So David has asked for Uriah the Hittite to come. Remember, he's one of the loyal men of David. And he comes, no question. No questions asked. He's loyal. Verse 7, Uriah has this awkward kind of discussion with David. David says, hi, how's Joab going? How's the battle going? He didn't need Uriah to come back and tell him this. We talk about messenger at the end of this chapter, how the messenger went back and forth. It's just a messenger. They don't get names, messengers. This one's Uriah. So here's this awkward discussion, almost some kind of small talk with no real getting down to business. You can just imagine this oddity that Uriah is thinking. He's thinking, well, come on, king, spit it out. What have you brought me back from the battle for? Come on, bring it out. And David doesn't come up with anything. He just says in verse 8, well, okay, great. Why don't you go back to your house, have a rest, have a bath, go and be with your wife. Again, very awkward, isn't it? And so David sends even a present of food back to the house. But what happens, of course, is that Uriah in verse 9, he doesn't go back to the house, does he? Where does he go? Well, it says that he goes and he sleeps at the entrance of the palace with the palace guards, instead of going home to his beautiful young wife and having a warm bath and a comfortable bed and a beautiful meal. Now, we're not told so much, but it must surely be a possibility. It certainly is in my mind that Uriah is starting to worry with a little bit of suspicion about David's real motives behind getting him back from the battle and just to talk small talk. And he strongly suggested, very strongly, that he go home to his wife and that he be with his wife. If he didn't suspect that his king might have lay with his wife, what was he to do? If he thought just for one moment that maybe my king has done this, what was he to do? Could he accuse his king? Could he accuse his wife? If she was to stay, if he was to stay at home in his house, for example, then if there was any suspicion around it, there's no proof. The baby comes along, it could well have been his. Is that the motive as to why Uriah doesn't go home? Well, we're not really told, are we? But perhaps. Why didn't Uriah accuse his wife? And what would happen if he did accuse his wife, do you think? What do you think happens to a woman that's accused of adultery under the law? Well, there is a process, isn't there, that you go through. He could have. And we won't go through this process in any form, but there it is in Numbers 5. If you don't have any witnesses and you think that your wife has been unfaithful, there was an offering called an offering of jealousy. It's quite an interesting process when you drill down into some of those points. But essentially, you would take your wife to the priest for an offering of jealousy, and the outcome was then only determined by the only witness, which is God himself. If guilty, then her ability to bear children would be cursed and she'd become unproductive. And that was the process. But Uriah doesn't do that. If Uriah had proof that his wife was unfaithful, with witnesses or confession, what would happen to her then if he accused? What do you think? It's an actual question. Stoned to death. Leviticus 20, verse 10. Not just her, but the man also. Both would be stoned to death. But Uriah doesn't do that either. All he chooses to do is to not sleep home. That's interesting, isn't it? I'm not going to sleep home. And not only that, but he makes it quite clear that everyone knows he didn't sleep home. Everyone. He had witnesses. And in verse 10, those witnesses come running up to David, don't they? And they tell David, saying, Uriah went not down unto his house. And so David quickly runs up to Uriah and says, why? Why aren't you going home, David? Why didn't you go home? I think that with each and everything that David continues to do from now on further confirms any suspicion perhaps in Uriah's mind. And the whole time Uriah is the man here that does nothing wrong, while David continues to dig his pit deeper and deeper, trying to cover the guilt of his conscience. Now you just think about, for a second, this faithful, loyal convert to the truth. He's followed David over the years. He's fought with him and continues to fight with him. Has proven to David his worth as a servant and a warrior, being listed among those who would gladly die for David. And he's been interrupted from fighting a hard-fought battle for his king by the king who should also be out there leading his army. David is his king, yes, but it's almost like he is more than that than to Uriah, because he's a comrade, he's a brother in arms, and one who brought him to the truth, to the God of Israel. And so as a loyal servant and a friend, Uriah doesn't just not do anything wrong, but he does everything right. And all the while, his every word is surely pricking at the troubled conscience of David. You have a look at verse 11. You have a look at what Uriah has to say. He says to David, he says, the ark. You know, he starts with something that David has so clearly seen as important, as incredibly important, the ark. David often worshipped and prayed with the ark and sang and danced before the ark. Everyone knows David loves the ark and dedicates himself to the ark and what it symbolises. And David wanted to even build a house for the ark. You see Uriah saying, the ark and Israel and Judah all abides in tents. My lord Joab and your servants, you know, they're all out there encamped in the fields. They're all fighting away in tents. And you asked me to come home and have a nice shower and be with my wife? As you live, he said, and as your soul lives, I'm not doing this thing. I'm not doing it. Well, of course, that shifts things for David, doesn't it? He's not going to be able to do this. So he thinks of another plan. So he moves from plan A to plan B. We all have plan Bs, don't we? Verse 12 and 13, David tries another poorly thought out trick, and he continues to confirm with Uriah that his king seems, this is only confirming in Uriah's mind that king seems very desperate and out of character, because he tries to get Uriah drunk in verse 13. Eat and drink, and he made him drunk. He doesn't try and get him drunk, he made him drunk, hoping that maybe he would stagger off home after he was drunk. But of course Uriah doesn't do that, does he? Again, he sleeps with the temple guard, with the palace guard. So he doesn't do that. And so we find in verse 14 that David then moves to plan C. And we all know that plan C is never a good thing, is it? Especially not for a desperate man. Particularly not if that desperate man is a king. And David went to another level lower and wrote a letter to expose his sin to a man that he knew would quite likely hold it against him. But here's David in a great moment of weakness. A great moment of weakness and struggle to cover his sin. Sin which is against God. Because sin, all sin is against God, isn't it? And he says that in Psalm 51. Involving the life of those that he loved, of those that he was closest to, his loyal servants. And he writes this letter, which is basically Uriah's death warrant. And not only that, he gets Uriah because he knows that he's so faithful to carry it. It's interesting, isn't it? To think that Uriah did no wrong, and then he still carried the very thing that ended up being his death. A bit like our Lord, really, isn't it? He did no wrong, and yet he carried that cross for us. Well, of course, in verse 15 and through to 17, we find that Joab, being Joab, quite gladly carried out this order and no doubt tucked away that letter for a rainy day. And although we're told nothing, what of Bathsheba through all of this? Was she aware that Uriah was summoned? Maybe not. Was she aware her husband refused to come home after night? Maybe, maybe not. And what about the stress of the entire situation for her? And then the report, of course, verse 26, that her husband is dead. Interesting, isn't it, verse 26? When I read that, kind of double emphasis all the way through it. As it says there, when it doesn't call Bathsheba, does it? There's no name Bathsheba, is there? It says, and when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, well, he's got to be the husband if she's the wife, okay, was dead, she mourned for her husband. It's like 3 times emphasising this fact. It says that she mourned for him. And it says at the end of verse 27 that this thing that David had done displeased Yahweh. Now all of this trouble and stress which had occurred after David, a man after God's own heart, had taken an idle stroll on his rooftop one night when he should have been looking up at the stars, which is what the rooftops were for praying. He was looking down. Did David wish that he could turn back the clock? I'm sure he did. Did David think that all was well now, perhaps? Uriah's out the way, all's well, not too many people know about it. I know, there's Joab and, perhaps. Was he hoping that all would be well? How was David's faith and relationship with his God at this point in time? And what about Bathsheba as well? Was he living with this sense of guilt and shame? Why didn't he confess to God? We'll have a look at the first verse in chapter 12. And this is the amazing thing, I find. The first 4 words really say a lot to me. It said, and Yahweh sent. It would seem after a period of 9 months, whereby David continues to live in denial of his sin. And so look what happened. God sends Nathan. Now to me that shows the amazing mercy of Almighty God. It's a bit similar to Adam and Eve, isn't it, in a way? I mean, they hid themselves, didn't they? And who? What happens? Did they come to God? No. God came walking through the garden and asking questions. The same thing happens here, isn't it? And so Nathan, the prophet, is brought out at this time to put forward this eloquent kind of parable, if you like, to help David understand what he has actually done. And does it so well that David ends up at the point of such emotional rage in condemning the accused sinner. So let's have a look at what it says in a few of these verses. In verse 1 and 2, it talks a lot about a rich man and a poor man and the difference between them. The rich man had exceeding many flocks and herds, but the poor man, he only had one little ewe. And I'll put this one up here because this helps to illustrate the rich man, if you like. This is like a family tree of David, or probably of Jesse, to be quite right. But yeah, I don't know if you can see that, yeah. You can see there how many, if you're talking about this one lamb for the poor man being Bathsheba, then we're talking about women, aren't we? This rich man, David, how many did he have? He had, what was it there? Ended up with 8 wives and 10 concubines that I can tell. He was rich, he had many flocks. He didn't need this one. And verse 3 goes on to suggest, well, it shows to me the closeness of Bathsheba and Uriah. and how that Uriah cared for nothing else in the world like he cared for her. And that she was possibly much younger than him, as we've mentioned before. And this verse to me only increases the sadness of this whole situation. And you can imagine if Uriah did know, just imagine if he did know what had gone on, just how sad that must have made him as he went to what he would have believed to be his sure death. It also shows to me that Bathsheba must have had a wonderful kind of caring husband, verse 3. He looked after her. She ate at his table. He cared for her. He lay with her in his bosom as he saw her as like a daughter, really, so part of him. Verse 4, we have this interesting term, this traveller, or this wayfaring man. It's a fitting description, isn't it, of what sin is. And for David, a man after God's own heart, of what sin should also be for us, a traveller, not a resident. But it's up to us as to how comfortable we are with the traveller, as to whether we allow them to stay, and for how long. For David, here in his state of unconfessed, the traveller was with him for 9 months. Now, of course, we're not endorsing any kind of external tempter by any means, as James 1 we went to certainly is against that, and we're drawn out of our own lusts and desires. And Christ backs that up again by saying that, all these evil things in Mark 7 come from within and defile a man. But here, David and Bathsheba's attention was given over to a traveller that came, as it does, come and go. But the traveller always leaves decay and damage. And that was definitely the case here. And so David, after hearing this story of this rich man, there came a traveller unto the rich man in verse 4, and he spared to take from any of his own flock, but of his own herds, to dress for the wayfaring man that was come unto him. But he took the poor man's lamb, and he dressed it for the man that was come to him. And David's anger, it says in verse 5, was greatly kindled against the man. And he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man that has done this thing shall surely die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold because of the thing that he did, because he had no pity." Was he right in his judgment? David was a king who often sat in judgment, as kings did. And so sitting and pronouncing judgment over your subjects, you have to have some idea about the law. Well, here he is. He says in verse 5 that as the Lord lives, the man shall surely die, and he shall restore 4 lambs. Well, he was right, really, wasn't he? Because that's what the law said. Leviticus 20 we've already referred to, but Exodus 22 says that if you steal an ox, you must give back 5 oxen for an ox. If you steal a lamb, you must give back 4 lambs for that one that you've stolen. So he was right, wasn't he? Now here's the irony in all of this, isn't it? How was David to pay for this? Because in the next verse, Nathan said to David, "You're this man. You're this rich man that you've just passed judgment upon." Look what happens to restoring 4 sheep for a sheep. 4 sons die. Isn't that justice, in a way? 4 of David's sons are payment for the one that you took. Well, Nathan goes on to explain, doesn't he, that there are consequences. There are always consequences. And eternally, and our God does forgive us, doesn't he? Because in verse 13, we see after Nathan has explained all of this, that in verse 13, Nathan says that God hath put away your sin. And isn't that a wonderful thing? So eternally, God does forgive us, but the consequences remain. And from that moment onwards, they would keep reminding both David and Bathsheba over and over and over again. And the baby boy, who was the outworking of that terrible deception of lust and sin, it was not named on the 8th day when normally they are named through the circumcision, because he died on the 7th day. And verse 19 tells us that the child was dead. And despite David's desperation, his desperate appeal for the life of that baby boy, and although there's no mention, by the way, of Bathsheba through all of this, make no mistake about it, she was there. Mothers love their boys. She would have been there. She would have been there cradling and comforting that poor baby boy as she watched its life slip away. And I know by personal experience just how much hurt that would have been for both of them. But in verse 24, we read that David comforted Bathsheba, his wife, and he went in unto her, and he lay with her, and she bare another son, and this time his name was Solomon. And look what it says at the end of that. Yahweh loved him. Isn't that beautiful? And Yahweh loved him, like as if he's blessing this union now. Because David and Bathsheba, no doubt, but David certainly is recorded here, confessed his sin. God had forgiven him. It was time for them to move on. And so Yahweh loved Solomon, and what an amazing king he turns out to be. But not without the faithful help of his mum, Bathsheba, because she plays a part. And we'll finish off with some of these thoughts around what happens next with Bathsheba. She plays a vital role in making sure that Solomon remains the next king. Just come over to 1 Kings. Because there's another little clue that I thought worth bringing out about this woman Bathsheba. We've spoken quite a lot about David, of course. But as I mentioned earlier, there's not a lot spoken about Bathsheba, but there is something here that I want to bring out, perhaps some clues about her. So in 1 Kings 1, we have this threat. David's getting old, he's approaching death, and what happens in those days when they're approaching death is it's a very tense time. And of course Adonijah, the brother of Absalom, one of David's sons, he makes a move to go and become king. And he takes with him Abiathar the priest and Joab, David's army captain, and decides to pronounce himself as king. And so desperately it would appear that in verse 11 of 1 Kings 1, Nathan once again chooses to go to Bathsheba. And he says to her, I want you to go and speak to the king about this. This is what's happening. This is exactly what's happening. The kingdom is moving away from you. You need to go and speak to David. David's old and in his bedroom. And so verse 15 through to 20, Bathsheba, it says, went in unto the king into this chamber, and the king was very old. And so she manages to convince the king that he ought to do something about this. And so, as it turns out, the king quickly makes some decisions. And in verse 30, we find that David reassures Bathsheba that yes, Solomon, thy son will reign after me. And so he makes these plans, and sure enough, this uprising of Adonijah is thwarted. It comes to nothing. And Solomon is then established as the king, the next king to reign. But then we have this peculiar scene where Adonijah, fearing for his life because he had done the wrong thing, grabs hold of the altar's horns and begs for mercy from Solomon. And in verse 52, Solomon gives Adonijah another chance. Gives him another chance and says, if you do everything right from now on, that's okay. You'll live. But then we come to chapter 2. We find that in verse 10, David dies after having reigned for some 80 years, a long time. And then we find in verse 12 that Solomon's kingdom now is established greatly, it says. And then Adonijah, who should have kept very quiet, living over in the far lands, decides to do this very peculiar thing, and she comes to Bathsheba. Why? You know, he wants to marry Abishag. So instead, what does he do? He comes to Bathsheba. Why Bathsheba? Because she's now the king's mother. That makes sense. She could probably talk to the king for me, which is exactly what Adonijah wants her to do. It's amazing in my mind that he even wants to go that far. He should just keep quiet and his head would stay on, essentially. But he doesn't. But what's more amazing that I find is that Bathsheba actually wants to go and do this for him. Why? What's in it for her? Why would she do that? Makes no sense to me at all. Perhaps she's conjuring up some kind of peace deal or something. I don't really understand that. But she goes to Solomon, her son, in verse 18 and 19, and she explains the situation to him and says, do you mind if, Adonijah takes Abishag to be wife? Well, she totally misread her son. She totally misread the situation, because Solomon doesn't do this at all. In fact, Solomon says the opposite. He says, should I not give him my kingdom as well? So he starts to go into this rage, doesn't he? And the end result of that, of course, is that Adonijah loses his head. He's a problem. So he gets rid of him. But what does this say about Bathsheba? It's peculiar to me, and all I can suggest is that Bathsheba, and this is probably looking a little bit more into her character, she had a lot of courage and to be able to turn David around and make sure that Solomon became king. But here is the other part of her character that I think is somewhat naive. Perhaps a little too trusting. And maybe that's the weak part of her character that got her into this mess in the first place. Well, some final thoughts. Let's not be too harsh on Bathsheba. We all have weaknesses. And they can vary from individual to individual. David certainly showed his weakness as women, which of course was obviously something passed on to his son as well. Life can throw many twists and turns at us, and we're very capable of making the worst decision. And whilst Bathsheba may have lacked some kind of foresight, or perhaps in some way she was naive, she nonetheless was mentioned, or at least referred to, in the lineage of Christ in Matthew 1 verse 6. It's interesting though, isn't it, that she's referred to and not actually named, but referred to as her. That was the wife of Uriah after this sad event. And it shows to us that Christ came not by this perfect lineage of Jewish people, but Christ came from imperfect lineage. And he came to save. He didn't come to perfect people that didn't need saving. He came to people that really needed saving, who had things go wrong in their life, who made poor decisions, who hurt a lot of others along the way. I'll leave you with some of these verses, because no one is perfect. But through faith, Bathsheba and David continued on. They endured through this time. Their life was changed, of course, but they endured through, believing in God's great mercy and power to save. And the bride of Christ, whom we include ourselves with, if we are seen to be faithful, are not made up of people that are perfect, but who are made perfect through our Lord Jesus Christ.